mind, especially questions about selfhood, self-consciousness, intersubjectivity, and empathy. He also connects these themes with disciplines like psychology, psychiatry, sociology, and anthropology. His major publications include Self-Awareness and Alterity, Husserl's Phenomenology, Subjectivity and Selfhood, The Phenomenological Mind with Sean Gallagher, Self and Other, Husserl's Legacy, Phenomenology, The Basics, and The Being We, the book we'll be discussing today. His works have been translated into more than 30 languages. Without making any further delay, may I request Professor Zahavi to start his talk. Over to you, Professor Zahavi.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Anilamba, and thanks to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to tell you all a little bit about this new book of mine. I'm also grateful for everybody who have joined. So I think what the plan is basically for me to start off with a small PowerPoint presentation where I will basically run through some of the main themes of the book, also just to introduce its content to those of you who might not already be familiar with it. And then after having done that, I hope we can have a kind of a conversation about some of the topics that I have been addressing. So let me see if I can figure out how to do this. Let's see. So I hope this works. Can you all see? Okay, great. Okay, so let me just move into it. The fact that we can solve tasks and reach decisions and share emotions and act together is something that has very much been in the focus of research in recent years, both within different empirical disciplines and also within a variety of different theoretical disciplines. Now, one of the interesting facts is that when looking at the empirical work, there has actually been an important inspiration coming from the side of philosophy, and one occasionally talks about a kind of a handful of mainly analytic philosophers who have worked on collective intentionality and whose work has then been taken up in these other disciplines. And the four kind of big four figures here is Searle, Bradman, Gilbert, and Tumula. Now, what they often do when talking about collective intentionality, when talking about we intentionality, is that they take their point of departure in a discussion of joint action. So how should we understand the fact that we can, go for a walk together, carry a piano together, cook together, paint a house together, etc. So it's very much focusing on action. And I think that this action focus, nobody wants to dispute that action is important, but I also think that the fact that there has been so much focus on action has kind of come with a certain price. And I think it has left a number of important issues somewhat underexplored. So let me try to highlight what I take to be three sets of questions that I think has been somewhat under-examined in recent discussions. And these three topics are also the three topics that my book is focusing on. The first set of topics basically deals with the question of how collective identity and self-identity are related. What is the relationship between the we and the I? Can we really understand what it means to feel or think or act as part of a we if we do not understand what it means to be a self? And does the fact that an individual can identify with a group, can adopt a we perspective, does that not also tell us something important about the nature and fluid character of self-identity? So that's the first set of questions. Second set of questions basically has to do with the issue of how collective intentionality relates to the topic of social cognition and interpersonal understanding. Can we really understand what it means to share perspective with others? if we do not have a proper account of what it means to understand and relate to others in the first place. And one question that for me was particularly pertinent was basically the question of whether there might be specific forms of interpersonal encounter that are especially conducive for the emergence of a we perspective. Finally, and this is the last set of questions, I mean, when talking about collective intentionality and when talking about the we, I mean, we should not make the mistake of assuming that a collective and a we is just one thing. There are actually a number of different ways in which we relationships can differ. They can differ in terms of the number of its members and its temporal duration. And so there are clear differences between the we of a dyad or a triad or a small team or a national community. And how should we understand those differences? And what kind of self-experience and what kind of interpersonal understanding do each of these different we relations require? Now, given that I think those topics that I have just been discussing or just been mentioning have been somewhat under-examined, one question, of course, is, well, how should we proceed? Now, when looking at the discussion of collective intentionality within analytic philosophy, it's striking that this is a fairly recent debate. One of the kind of founding books that really were instrumental in kind of kicking off this analytic discussion is Searle's book, The Construction of Social Reality. And it's kind of interesting that Searle, in the introduction to that book, basically makes the claim that previous theorists, including some of the great kind of philosophers, sociologists from the early 20th century, were really not able to address and examine the problem of collective intentionality. And the reason why Searle is mentioning this is, of course, because he himself, prior to publishing The Construction of Social Reality, had published another book on intentionality, on individual intentionality. And so clearly what Searle is proposing here is that unless you have a proper account of individual intentionality, you cannot really address the problem of collective intentionality. Now, in making this claim and in making this assessment about what the tradition has accomplished or not accomplished, he refers to the work of Weber, Simmel, and Durkheim, of course, three great sociologists. But it's kind of striking that he forgets to mention Alfred Schutz. Now, Schutz's most famous book, Der sinnhafte Aufbau der sozialen Welt, has, of course, a title that somewhat resembles, Searle's title, but there are more similarities between the two books than simply the title. Because what Schutz was doing in that book was really to employ a phenomenological account of intentionality to tackle foundational problems in sociology. And in doing so, Schutz was not kind of inventing something from scratch. He was actually drawing on a very rich existing tradition in German philosophy that really were working on collective intentionality and which, in contrast to the more recent debate, was specifically and explicitly engaging with the three sets of questions that I was just highlighting a moment ago. Now, clearly, I won't have time to go into all these different works, but this is just a quick overview of what I take to be a very, very kind of fertile discussion that basically took place from shortly before the outbreak of World War I until the early 30s. There were kind of 2 decades where a number of phenomenologists were working on collective intentionality, were working on the problem of the we. And so what I have tried to do in this recent book of mine that came out last year is basically to draw on these resources. I'm trying to kind of excavate what I take to be the systematic, convincing, nuggets of insights. And then I'm trying to relate that to contemporary discussions in both philosophy and the social sciences. And so what I will do again, so clearly I don't have time to go through the entire book, but let me just try to highlight some of the kind of main claims that I make in the book. So one important question to start with really has to do with, why talk about phenomenology here? Why talk about experience? Why is that important if we want to understand the nature of the we? And I think one way to motivate this specific approach is by highlighting a difference between different types of groups. So there's some groups for which membership of those groups can be determined based on the presence of a certain set of objective features. So consider, for instance, membership of blood group AB or membership of the BMI, obesity category. Now, whether or not you belong in those groups is really not up to you. It's not up to your view, your perspective, your approval. And whether or not you are a member is really something that can be externally assigned based on the presence of certain objective characteristics. And you can even be assigned, again, membership to those groups, even if you actively disidentify with the group in question, because your identification is really not relevant. Now, I think that kind of external enforced classifications are precisely not what we should be looking for if we want to understand the nature of the we. Because being a member of a we is really something that involves a certain subjective sense of togetherness or belongingness, as Turner, the social psychologist, put it. So one way to frame that is basically to say that in contrast to, kind of the objective aggregates or sets, membership of a we is something that requires an experiential anchoring. And again, one way to push that point is by insisting that a we in the first instance is a plural subject. It's not an externally observed entity. It's something that is experienced from within. And so being a member of a we is something that involves some kind of awareness of oneself as a member or participant. It's something that involves rather than bypasses the self-identity and first-person perspective of the involved parties. And it also, and this is something I will come back to shortly, it's also something that involves a specific kind of relationship between yourself and other members of that we, namely a relationship of identification. Now, a we, again, is a first-person plural pronoun or plural perspective. And insofar as it's first personal, it's something that requires an experiential anchoring. It's something that must be experienced from within. But the we is also first-person plural. It's something that requires plurality. So I think it's very important, to keep in mind that difference and plurality are as essential to a we as unity. And if one keeps that in mind, I think one has to reject the proposal that we experiences is something that precedes the difference between self and other, that a we is something that precedes and ultimately enables individual differentiation. I think that way of thinking about the we has to be rejected as incoherent because it does not take the plurality of the we seriously. Now, arguing that a we is not something that can enable self-other relations, but rather something that requires those relations, is of course not to say that any conception of self is compatible with the existence of we relation. And in fact, I would say that part of what I was trying to do in the book was also to say that if we accept that we relationships are genuine phenomena, I mean, that is going to put pressure on the conception of selfhood that we are operating with, because there are certain notions of selfhood that just have to be discarded because they do not allow for something like a joint we perspective. For we relationship to be possible, I think we need to move beyond, on the one hand, a notion of self that sees it as a socially determined epiphenomenon. And I also think we need to move beyond a notion of self that sees the self basically as a disembodied agent. More specifically, and again, I'll be happy to elaborate on that in the conversation, what I try to argue for in the book is that we actually need to incorporate two different dimensions of self if we want to do justice to, and if we want to allow for something like we relationships. On the one hand, we need to appeal to an experiential dimension of self that captures the first personal and perspectival character of consciousness. But I also think that we need to appeal to and integrate a normative discussion of the self, where that normative dimension doesn't merely relate to a specific style that our experiential life comes to possess as a result of the experiences that we accumulate and as a result of our ongoing socialization. But it's also a normative dimension that comes in place as a result of the commitments that we take to be, guiding our lives. And again, in the tradition, I think one can find different proposals in terms of how to cash out these distinctions. I speak of an experiential self and a normative self. Other people would, for instance, speak about a relationship or a distinction between selfhood and personhood. So, I mean, there are different ways that distinction that I've just introduced have been kind of cashed out in the literature. Now, talking about a self is kind of a starting point, but clearly we can't, make do with that, because there is more to a we than me. There's more to the we than just oneself. And as important as it is to get clear on the relationship between we and I, as important it also is to understand the experiential relationship that members have to each other. Now, I think one fairly obvious point to make is that if something like dyadic we experiences are to occur, the participants cannot be unaware of each other. And here then the question pops up that I already alluded to a moment ago. Are all forms of interpersonal understanding, all forms of social cognition equally conducive to the emergence of a we? Now, I don't have time to go into a very extensive discussion of these different forms of other knowledge or other experience, but let me just briefly contrast two very different accounts of how we come to obtain knowledge of other minds, how we come to understand others. Now, on a currently still influential view, the minds of others are hidden, they are invisible, and the mental states of others are unobservable constructs. So this is still a widespread view in cognitive science. Another kind of competing and very different account basically argues that it is possible to obtain information about other people's mental states by way of expressivity. Observation of bodily expressions, observation of expressive behavior can directly inform us about other people's mental states. Now, if you have that contrast between these two very different proposals in mind, then consider the following very everyday example. Group of friends is gathered around a dinner table. They enjoy each other's company, somebody tells a joke, and they all laugh together. This, I think, would be a case of emotional sharing. Now, if asked which of the two accounts I just alluded to is best aligned with and best capable of allowing for something like emotional sharing, I would say that the answer is fairly obvious. I mean, were one to assume that the first view is correct, were we to assume that consciousness is at best a private phenomenon that is invisible to others, I think it would be very hard to make sense of the notion of shared experiences in any but the most metaphorical sense. And so I also don't think it should come as a huge surprise that phenomenologists have by and large opted for the second proposal. As Gerda Walther argues in her dissertation from the early 20s, if emotional sharing is to occur, it's not enough to know indirectly, be it inferentially or through some kind of imaginative perspective taking about the other's emotion. Rather, if emotional sharing is to occur, the participants must have a distinct kind of access to each other's emotional life. Or to put it differently, if emotional sharing is to be possible, it requires a specific kind of experiential connectedness. Now, how should we think of that connectedness? Well, what we find discussed by Husserl is basically the idea that that we intentionality and also IU relationships is something that emerges and is based on reciprocal empathy. Now, why does Husserl talk about the you? Why does he suggest that the route to a we goes through the you? And I mean, Husserl is not the only one to suggest that. Here's a quote from another famous thinker about the IU relationship, namely Martin Buber, who writes, "Only men who are capable of truly saying thou to one another can truly say we with one another." Now, I think my way of spelling out what it means to relate to somebody as a you, and I mean, this is something I discuss in the longest chapter in the book, is that the main difference between relating to somebody as a you vis-a-vis relating to somebody as he or she is that I'm relating to somebody as a you if the person I'm relating to is also relating to me as a you. So relating to somebody as a you is something that necessarily has to be reciprocated. To adopt a second person perspective is to stand in a subject-subject relation where I'm not merely aware of the other in a particular manner, but I'm at the same time aware myself of being attended to or addressed by the other. So what is very peculiar about the IU relationship is that it's something that directly affects the self-experience of the participants. And this again is something that many of the phenomenologists have pointed to. Here, for instance, is how Schutz describes it in a book he wrote with Thomas Luckmann. In the we relation, our experiences are not only coordinated with one another, but are also reciprocally determined and related to one another. I experience myself through my consociate, and he experiences himself through me. The mirroring of self in the experience of the stranger, more exactly in my grasp of the other's experience of me, is a constitutive element of the we relation. And I think what is so important in this quote is precisely this emphasis of the fact that the we relationship is something that really involves and transforms one's own self-understanding. It's a self-understanding that is modulated by the gaze or the perspective of the other. So I think that, well, again, as I just pointed out, I mean, having we experiences and standing in we relationships is really something that transforms one's own perspective on things. And I think again that if we are to label or describe actions or experience or emotions as shared, I mean, the way that they are lived through by the participants should no longer be simply a question of me having my experiences plus you having your experiences. No, the way we need to live through these experiences and these actions, if they are to be shared, if they are to be ours, is precisely as experiences and actions that we are undergoing together. And in order for that to happen, in order for the experiences or actions or emotions to be given as ours, it's not enough that we simply recognize that there are other people around who are also having experiences, because the way we relate to those others have to be not as objects of observation, but as co-subjects. And that is precisely something that can happen in an I-you relationship. So again, my way of talking about this would be to say that when I'm standing in an I-you relationship, I am precisely incorporating the other's perspective on myself. And I think that that identification or that incorporation is precisely what can then give rise to a certain sense of togetherness, a certain sense of shared identity and concern. Now I'm coming quickly to my end. I think I have just 2 slides back. So what I want to highlight, and this is primarily then what ideas I'm cashing out in the last part of the book, which has to do with varieties of we, is precisely to point out that we cannot remain focused simply on dyads or triads, for that matter, if we want to discuss we relationships. I mean, some types of we's involve relationships with known others, but clearly there are other types of we's that are much more anonymous, where one adopts a certain group identity, where I identify with others, with whom I share a certain common ground or a certain normative praxis, even if I don't know them personally as individuals. And I mean, this could, for instance, one way to think about that would be like, a national community or a religious community would be obvious cases. I mean, if one is a believer, one might identify with other believers of the same religion, even though, of course, one do not know all of them personally. Now, again, coming back to Gerda Walther, whom I already mentioned, I mean, she makes this distinction between we experiences in the narrowest sense that involves spatio-temporal interaction, and then what she calls a more a kind of group-based or a kind of group-based experiences. And the point she basically makes is that as a result, for instance, of my upbringing, my socialization, I mean, I might come to be shaped in a certain way. I might come to identify and internalize with rules, normative practices, rituals, traditions that we share in our community. And I might, as a result of this identification, come to perform actions and have experiences that are precisely characterized not simply as this is what I do and this is what I think and what I believe, but rather that this is how we feel about matters, this is how we do things. And this is precisely something that can happen even if I'm alone. I mean, I might be shaped in all kinds of ways, for instance, by my national community. I might behave like the typical Dane, and in that sense embody or instantiate specific forms of collective practices, even if I'm physically alone. So we need to recognize the existence of those kinds of we relationships as well. So again, it would be a mistake to identify the we merely with a relationship occurring between people who know each other and who are, actually interacting with each other. We are not simply individuals who on occasion act with others. We are community members. We are shareholders in collective identities. And the way we are together with others are in all kinds of ways supported by communal practices, by linguistically mediated norms and conventions and various institutions. And I mean, community membership has clear normative implications. They will guide how we think, feel, act, even if we do so when alone. And I mean, when looking at more complex forms of groups, I mean, one thing that also has to be added, which is somewhat absent in most cases, at least from dyadic relationships, is precisely what we could call power hierarchies. Again, group organizations group formations of a certain size will often involve divisions of tasks, roles, and positions, and there might be, instances where some members of the we are entitled to make decisions on behalf of the other members, and where other members are requested to obey the decisions that, say, the representative or the president or the director of the group are making. So again, just to make the case that when looking at and when considering we formations or we relationships, one really has to have an eye on how much they can vary. I mean, all the way from the intimate dyad to, say, a national community. I think this is all I wanted to say. So I've just given you a small overview of some of the themes that I'm discussing in the book, and I now look forward to our conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Dan, for this presentation. I'm just curious about two things that you were talking about, two different dimensions of the self, experiential and normative. So do you presume that there is a metaphysical self staying behind these dimensions?
But listen, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what you mean, a metaphysical self standing behind those dimensions. I mean, so I don't know what you mean by that.
I'm talking about the metaphysical as in the sense of the substantial self. I mean, the self.
But listen,
Descartes would argue for, or.
Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, so let me make this analogy. Let's look at consciousness. I mean, I think consciousness is characterized by certain features. I mean, I think it would be a really strange question to ask, do I also believe in a metaphysical conception of consciousness which is somehow standing behind lived experiences? No, of course I don't. I mean, but that is not to say that I do not think that the self that I'm talking about are real. So if your question concerning metaphysics is a question about reality, I don't have any worries about calling the experiential self and the normative self real, but I'm not interested in postulating some kind of substantial entity that is, I don't know where. I mean, and I don't understand. I'm sorry that I'm getting a little bit emotionally, here, but it's just like I don't. I mean, it's just that this point about the metaphysics of self is a point that is constantly being made by people who want to deny the existence of self. And I think most people who want to defend the existence of self, I mean, are not appealing to a kind of strange substantial entity that is, beyond and beneath or above, the phenomena that we are describing. So I think I guess the short answer to this very long rating is no. Yeah. I do not want to commit to that. Sorry. Yeah.
And could you just elaborate the role of empathy in we experience?
Sure. So I mean, that comes back to this discussion about the extent to which we are able to experience others. I mean, so again, the claim I'm basically making in the book is that if we are to make sense out of the idea that we can share a perspective on something, that we can share emotions, that we can share experiences. I mean, in order for that notion to make any sense, I don't think we can accept a model that proposes that consciousness is completely private. It's only visible for the owner of the experiences, and every other consciousness is necessarily invisible. I mean, if that was the case, I don't understand how something like shared experiences could occur. So I think what we find in phenomenology is precisely an idea that, that is basically the idea that there is something like other experience. Fremderfahrung is the German term. And I mean, the way that the phenomenologists are talking about empathy is precisely a way of trying to give credibility to the suggestion that there is a certain way in which we can come to experience and not merely infer or imagine the experiences of others. And so I do think that empathy, again, understood as a certain relationship to the kind of bodily expressivity of others, is very important in order for this whole, account to get off the ground. Yeah.
So we're moving on to other questions. Neha has a question, I guess. She's raising her hand. Neha, could you unmute yourself? Hi, Neha, are you there?
Yeah. And can you please switch on your video?
Yeah, we can see you,
Yeah. So my question is, how do you understand solidarity towards other? And so in dialectical pluralism, we read that the relation of we and us is like something a kind of hierarchical, like when we think of we and I, so there is certain reference point of a privileging reference point for I. In respect to that, we call something as we. So like this hierarchical relationship is there. So we also like read solidarity and understand solidarity. So like this, all of us should be like we in relation to one another. So my question is, how do you understand solidarity towards other? And the second question is about this idea of empathy or sympathy. Because for my understanding, I believe that when we talk about like this being sympathetic towards others, it's like very moral and very ethical kind of questions. But if suppose there is no hierarchy, or there is no division, then we don't need sympathy at all. So how do you understand, like, what is your take on this matter?
Okay, I think let me start with the last question. I mean, one difficulty when talking about empathy and sympathy is that people are really disagreeing about exactly what these notions are supposed to mean, and some people also use sympathy and empathy as if they were synonyms. I mean, they're using them interchangeably. So I guess, I think the first question really has to do with how do we define these terms. I mean, I was talking about empathy. I think what the phenomenologists have to say about empathy is rather different from how many psychologists today would talk about empathy, because I mean the main so again, I mean, the discussion is very confused, but two main proposals that one can encounter in the contemporary debate is the proposal either that empathy is a form of imaginative perspective taking. It's about me imagining what it would be like to be in your shoes. So it's about imagination. Another proposal has to do with the idea that empathy is primarily a question of affective sharing. So if you are distressed and if I empathize with you, I basically partake in your distress. The phenomenologists are disagreeing with that. They have a very different account of what empathy is, and that's also the notion that I'm kind of taking on board. So again, as I also explained to Nilamba, I mean, for me, empathy basically has to do with a specific kind of experiential encounter with others. the basic idea is that in a face-to-face relationship, we have the opportunity to have, to have an encounter with the mental life of others that has an immediacy and a presence to it, that is very different from, me imagining what you must be living through, or me inferring what people far away must be living through. So I think there is something immediate about what evolves or what manifests itself in this face-to-face relationship. That's what I mean with empathy. And it doesn't have any specific pro-social connotations. I mean, I can empathize with people I hate. I can empathize with people that I want to hurt. Empathy is not about, it's not pro-social in the way I'm talking about it. Then back to the issue of solidarity. Well, I do think that, if you take yourself to be a member of a we relationship, I think that that requires certain bonds or links of identification. I also think of course, again, it depends a little bit on what kind of we are talking about. But think about a romantic partnership. The kind of identification that I think goes on between the partners, I think also involves having shared concerns. I mean, it's also about the well-being of your partner being of importance to your own well-being. So I think solidarity clearly has a role to play there. I also think if we kind of move it up to a very different scale, I mean, if my national community is to mean anything at all, I mean, if I really identify, say, as a Dane, I think there are certain normative commitments that would involve, including certain certain bonds of solidarity. I mean, so I think there would be something very strange there would be a kind of contradiction involved if one were to say, on the one hand, I identify as a member of this group, I identify with other people who kind of buy into the ethos of the group, but actually their well-being is of no concern to me. I mean, I think that would be a strange mismatch. So I think on the account that I want to favor, I think sharing a certain we identity or a certain collective identity with others, I mean, it does involve solidarity. And of course, I mean, just one final thing. I mean, I don't think it follows from this that I should not have any moral, obligations or commitments vis-a-vis people that are not part of my we. I mean, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that we only have moral obligations vis-a-vis those with whom we identify. I think one could make, the argument that we also have moral obligations and commitments vis-a-vis those who are not members of our own group. But this is a slightly different discussion. So I just wanted to make it clear that I'm not committed to some kind of, parochial view according to which we only have moral obligations vis-a-vis those with whom we identify. So, I mean, I hope that kind of partly answers your questions.
So before moving on to the next question, we have Professor Shyamoshree Bhattacharya with us. May I request Professor Bhattacharya if she has any question to ask Professor Zahavi? Professor Bhattacharya, are you there?
Professor, you need to unmute yourself if you are speaking.
Yeah, am I audible now?
Yes,
you are.
Yeah. Okay, it's a fascinating lecture and a presentation. I wish I had gone through your book, Professor Dan Zahavi. I have one interesting thing that in this presentation, it is more of a hermeneutical approach that we are discussing about, because to know the other, to have some kind of empathetic understanding for this we intentionality, isn't it something like we are understanding the other? It's something, it is based on a kind of hermeneutic approach that we are discussing here. The we self, to have this we intentionality, isn't it something that when you were talking about empathy and gaze of the others, so it is a kind of interpreting the other, how we interpret ourselves in a group or in a crowd or in a kind of, community. So we are all in the sense interpreting. So in this sense, I was thinking whether the whole we intentionality, it falls back on one kind of hermeneutic understanding of ourselves. So can we just, what is your opinion on this?
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, so I don't know if there is, a kind of, background assumption in your question that has to do with a specific understanding of the relationship between phenomenology and hermeneutics, because again, on some accounts, it's important to make a very clear distinction here. Phenomenology is descriptive. Hermeneutics is exactly interpretative, and that's two very different ways of going about doing philosophy. I don't share that view. I think it's a kind of a very artificial separation. I think most phenomenologists would agree that experience involves an element of interpretation. So just that as a kind of a background, statement, and of course, so I think, again, the people that I'm primarily drawing on in this in the book, the phenomenologists that I'm mainly drawing on, these are all early German phenomenologists, and none of them would have talked about hermeneutics. They would not frame their own project as a hermeneutical enterprise. And so, these are not Heideggerians. They are, to a large extent, Husserlians. And of course, this is both prior to Heidegger, but also prior to Gadamer, for that matter. So I think hermeneutic would not have been a concept that they would readily employ in order to kind of classify or categorize what they were doing. But having said all of that, perhaps one way to meet you would be by agreeing that there is something, if you will, provisional when we are talking about we identities. There's something fragile. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that of course, there's no infallibility here. I might think of myself as a very, exemplary member of a certain group, and actually it turns out that the other members of the group in no way recognizes me as a proper member. And so my experience of being a group member actually is not veridical, because I think group membership is not just a question of how I experience matters, it's also a question of how other reciprocates my understanding. So that would be one way, one example of how my understanding eventually turns out to be mistaken. One could also, come up with another example. I've had dinner with a friend, or perhaps a potential romantic partner. I think it has been an absolutely wonderful evening, and I as a departing word, I say, we really had a wonderful evening together, and then whoever it was that I had dinner with looks me in the eye and kind of shakes her head and says, no, it was absolutely terrible. So of course, there's something provisional, something fragile about we identities, and perhaps one could capture that fragility by talking of it as a certain hermeneutical process. I would not per se have a problem with that. But again, I don't think that means that it's not phenomenology, because as I started out by saying, I think this traditional division between descriptive phenomenology on the one hand and some kind of interpretative hermeneutics on the other, I think is something of a bogus distinction.
Okay, thank you. But still, in Husserl's life world, in the later writings, when he's talking of the life world, there we are talking of the other. And in that sense, he is, I think, somehow referring to this understanding the other. Though it's a descriptive phenomenology, I do understand Husserl's is one of the descriptive ones. But in his later writings, The Crisis of the European Sciences, and there he is somehow, I think, referring to this notion of understanding the other. I may be wrong. That reading.
No, of course not. Yeah, but really. So I wrote my dissertation on intersubjectivity in Husserl. So it's a topic that I know fairly well. And Husserl's preoccupation with the other did not only come into full force and crisis. It's much earlier. It's already from around 1908. So he wrote for 30 years on the other, and it was clearly a topic that had his interest, and I think there are very specific reasons for that. That basically has to do with the idea that for Husserl, if we are to understand objectivity, if we are to understand how objectivity is constituted, Husserl would argue this is something that happens intersubjectively. And so in order for Husserl to account for the constitution of objectivity, he necessarily had to come up with a phenomenologically plausible account of how we come to understand others, because that's where intersubjectivity kind of gets off the ground. So the other and intersubjectivity is absolutely crucial to Husserl, but I just think this is, again, this is not per se, the fact that it has this importance doesn't really play into the question of whether he's doing hermeneutics or not. I really think that's a different issue.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Walther, for your question, and Professor Zahavi for clarifying them. So we are moving back to the question. We can see 5 hands are raising. Onugya, if you just unmute yourself and turn on your screen and ask your question to Professor Zahavi. Hi. So yeah.
Am I not audible?
No, we cannot hear you. Yeah.
Sorry, am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Now you're audible.
Okay. So thank you for the talk. That was really interesting. And I just wanted to think alongside you a little bit, just to, one question I was thinking of was that in the question of I and we both, there is a question of unity. As in, when I say I lay claim to a unified subject who is I, and similarly with we. It can be a dyad, it can be a whole nation, but there is some idea of unity in it. And that sort of led me to thinking about the question of sovereignty, because in the Indian Constitution, for example, our preamble begins with "We, the people of India," and in the name of this "we," everything happens. And again, so I was thinking of this question of how. In usual thinking, we think that, so for example, even the question of laughing at a joke together, we proceed from I to a sudden moment of we, which is a fragile moment. It might not last. Because we laugh once doesn't mean we become a we for long. But I was thinking that in ordinary sort of experience, it seems that we comes before I in our social, for example, I'm thinking of something like, say, Antigone or Achilles when he stops fighting. Before that, he is part of a we. And then in that moment when he decides that, no, I'm not going to fight this war for a certain time, that is when he starts thinking about who am I to be here and be part of this who are the Greeks, or whatever way we want to phrase this. So I was just wondering how we want to think of this problem of unity in just laying claim to the first person. There is sovereignty seems to be at stake in both, whether we do it in the singular or the plural. So I was wondering if something you wanted to say about it.
Yeah, no, I think those are great questions, and I think I mean, I don't think I can, answer them satisfactorily, given the kind of limited amount of time we have to our disposal. But let me just say a few things. So I agree with you. I mean, talking about a we, I mean, does of course suggest a certain unity. I mean, if a we, because I did emphasize, okay, plurality is important, preservation of difference is important. But of course, if it was just plurality and difference, well, then, one could say, what is then the difference between, constituting a we with others and not constituting a we with a lot of others that are also there and with whom one might constitute a certain plurality and difference. So clearly, a we does, there's so to speak more unity between members of a we than between members of one we and outgroup members. I mean, that kind of seems to make a lot of sense. And I think my way of trying to understand this balance between unity and plurality is to say that the unity of a we is a unity that preserves the plurality. It does not eradicate it. And one metaphor one could use is basically the metaphor of a bridge. I mean, a bridge unites two sides that remains distinct. So there's a huge difference between, a bridge uniting or linking two sides vis-a-vis, filling up, I don't know, the canal with earth such that there are no difference between the left side and the right side anymore. I mean, that would be a way of eradicating the plurality. So I think we need both unity and difference. Then there is the issue of sovereignty, and I agree with you as well that to some extent, I mean, the moment you join in a we, I mean, there are also certain things clearly that you are no longer capable of deciding on your own. I mean, because making a decision as a we is precisely something that requires all members to somehow be heard. I mean, so if one person basically makes all the decision on behalf of us, I mean, if that happens without other people acknowledging and supporting the decision that is being made, well, then I think it's a fake we. I mean, then it's a dictatorial we. It's an abuse of the term we. I mean, if something like that happens, so we need somehow to give up part of our autonomy. I think that is also what it means to reach decisions as a we. I mean, again, if you and your family are supposed to figure out where to go on vacation, and if it's supposed to be a we decision, again, all parties have to be heard. If it's only one person who makes the decisions, then it's not really a we decision. And then there was the question. Yeah, sorry.
Is this a normative we then? Because this is not how we. I mean, in the real world, we all the time we hear. I mean, for example, when the protests about the Palestine issue happened in the USA, the we that acts in the name of the government of the US and the we that is the college students or even in Europe when Brexit or something like that happens, the we that can take an action and the we that comes out on the streets and says not in our name or something like that, those we's are always at odds with each other. So in an ideal world, we should not be like this, but it's always sort of there are always these conflicts, and we is getting reconfigured through these conflicts all the time.
Yeah, no. So I mean, you're of course also making again acute and astute observations, but I mean, just think of the case you mentioned, not in our name. I mean, that of course suggests that there are actually more than just one we here. I mean, you know, so the government might say we all citizens of a certain country are behind the decision. And then there might be a subpart who say, well, not in our name. I mean, you don't speak for us. But I think when they are saying that, they are not talking about all the citizens. They are talking about their subgroup. So I think one also has to, again, accommodate the fact that they're not just one we, there are many different we's, and each of us can also partake in many different we's at the same time. I also think it would be a mistake to assume that for each of us, you know, being part of a we is a one-to-one thing, and you can't have many different, you know, identities. I think we all have a variety of different collective identities. But I just wanted also to come back to this other question about Achilles, about, you know, what has priority, the we and the I. And again, I mean, I think it's a complicated question, but again, for me, one obvious point of departure has to do with developmental psychology. I mean, you know, you might very well argue that the moment Achilles decides not to fight this war, the moment he kind of decides to, you know, leave the we that he had until then partaken in, that this might, you know, allow for a certain individualization that was not present prior, and one could then say that the individuation that happens is to some extent one that happens on the background of a we. I think that is correct, but of course we also need to ask the following question: how did Achilles manage to be part of that we in the first place? And I think it would be weird to claim that this was something he partook in from the moment he was born. I mean, clearly it's also a process of socialization. And again, we then need to look at what kind of relationships, I mean, must be in place in order for us to acquire the capacities to identify with, say, a national community. And I think that's a complicated story, but I don't think we can say that membership of a national community is the starting point. I mean, I think that would be a very weird way of looking also at human development. So I think, again, my view would be, if you were not in possession of first personal experiences, which I think is what allows us also to navigate, you know, the physical environment. It's what allows us to relate to others, to recognize others, to address others. I mean, if it was not for that fact, if it was not for the fact that we are primarily conscious creatures, I don't think something like membership of a national community could occur. So I think there's a certain spiraling process going on here. There are certain, I think, features that we need to posit as kind of part of the foundational, part of the kind of starting package. And then as a result of, I mean, socialization, we become part of a certain community. And then at some point, by leaving that community, this might then also allow for further developments of our individuality. So I think, again, it's not a you know, unilateral direction. I think it's more like a spiral. But again, the question is, where does it start? And my view would be, you know, it starts primarily with us being embodied experiences, not with us being members of a national or military group. I mean, so. But I mean, again, I thought it was very nice questions you had.
Okay, so Christiane, if you can ask question to Professor Zahavi. Hi.
He's having some problem with his microphone, I guess. So we can move to somebody else.
No, has she written any question? No. Okay, so
No.
So so Shostik Banerjee, you have raised your hand, so could you just ask your question?
Yes. Hi.
Please turn on your camera.
My question is rather simple. Like it's regarding if this we, it basically reduces to individual subjects who seem to be in coordination with another when we are discussing. But the question basically I wonder is there any particular factor grounding this usness or we-ness? Like, or is it constant or is it changing based on the context? Or can we actually come across a individual factor? And by that, I don't mean a metaphysical self or something. I mean a factor through which we can just determine that like how this we will be defined in every a grounding factor for this usness. I hope that.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, so just to make it clear, I mean, one of the points I made was that we need to distinguish between different types of we's. I think there are certain we's that precisely are established on the basis of coordination, responsiveness. So that's one kind of we. So again, very simply, let's assume that somebody asks a group of people, will some of you come and help me carry this table up the stairs? Well, some of us volunteers for the task, and of course, in order to carry the table up the stairs, we need to kind of calibrate our movements and, in a certain way, where as a result of that calibration, one can then say afterwards, well, we carried up the table. So that's one kind of we. Again, I think that, being a member of a religious community or being the member of, I don't know, a soccer fan club, this is not about coordinating your movements in specific ways. Clearly, we need to understand the membership in very different ways. And so the way I would understand it would be to think of those kind of we memberships primarily as being a question of identifying with a certain ethos or with certain norms or goals or ideas that one takes to be constitutive for the group in question. So again, whether we are part of that we together really has to do with whether we take that ethos or those norms or those values as somehow central to our self-understanding. And so if you say if there's some kind of grounding factor that will establish whether or not there is a we, well again, I would say, I mean, for me, it is this question of whether there is an identification or not. I mean, do you identify with specific norms, values, traditions in such a way that you take those values somehow to be formative for how you view yourself? Is it something that has an impact on your self-understanding? Then I think that the group identity is clearly relevant for you, and other people with the same group identity would then be fellow members of the we in question. I mean that would be the way I would view it.
Okay. So Christiane has written down. Sorry. Would you like to add something? Okay.
So I just had one more doubt. It's regarding when individual refers as we, there is a language usage. How do you see that? If the if the Queen of England is referring, or even in Sanskrit we have that Sammanartha we use like, how do you see it? Like, because if the Queen of England is saying, she will be saying that we are deciding, then I am deciding. Like, how do you place that? In that, it's an individual identifying as we and not a group. So that's the last question I had.
Yeah. No. Thanks. I mean, so again, I should also make clear that, I mean, my main focus has not been, if you will, on language games or linguistics. I mean, my focus has been on more, I mean, has been on the experiential, level. So again, what does it mean to share emotions? What does it mean to, act as a group member? In some cases, those shared experiences, those group identities can then be articulated linguistically. And I think it's an interesting question what that articulation does for the experience in question. I mean, again, and I think there's an interesting, complicated story to say about that. Now, the specific case you mentioned about the Queen, I mean, I would just say, well, this is a strange oddity. I mean, I don't think this is really, I don't think it really tells us anything very significant about the nature of a we, that there is this majestic use of the plural. I mean, just like I would also say the fact that, well, let's assume that I had 9 children who are all underage, and then, at one point I declared, we have now decided to sell our house and move to an island. I mean, I think, and this comes back to one of the previous questions, I think the use of the term we, I mean, even if I'm saying a sentence that is correctly formulated, I would still say that the use of the we in this specific instance is a bit problematic, because it's really me who has taken the decision. And so it's a bit like, I mean, I wouldn't say it's not an abusive form of we, but it's a bit like I think it's to some extent it's a misuse of the term, because it's actually not capturing an experiential phenomenon where all the parties involved would agree with that description. So clearly, the way we use language and what that language use is supposed to articulate or capture, I mean, can kind of, can part ways. And I think we have to allow for that to happen. So I don't think that language use in and of itself is, so to speak, the golden key to an insight into what a we is.
Okay,
Thank you.
So yeah. Thank you, Sostik, for asking this question. So I'm just reading what Christiane has written. So how is it possible to think about the relationship if, in the case of deliberation and free adherence to a norm as a norm, although we can decide together with others, the deliberation itself can only take place in first person? It is the question.
Yeah, well, I think I would disagree with that. I mean, I think deliberation can very much happen also in the form of a dialogue. And I think anybody, I mean, so of course, I mean, if you are deliberating together with others, I mean, it does not eradicate your first person perspective, just like being part of a we does not eradicate your first person perspective. But I think by deliberating with others, I mean, you can reach deliberations that are very different from the kind of deliberations you could, accomplish on your own. So I would say deliberation, communication, dialogue. I mean, why not think of deliberation as something that can happen and be enriched by being, situated in that specific context? So I'm not sure I fully understand the question, unfortunately.
Okay, so Hey Sing Chen Chi, could you please unmute yourself and ask question to Professor Zahavi?
Hi, thanks. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, we can.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for the talk, and I'm very enjoying your book a lot. And just brief background that I'm currently doing research on empathy. So I have a question regarding IU relationship. So my question is, how does misunderstand others' perspective happen if all we need is directly perceiving others? And even that, I can adjust my understanding during reciprocal interaction, and misinterpretation arguably happened. So how to explain such misinterpretation in terms of reciprocal IU relationship per se, without appeal to, for example, anticipating others' mind during interaction? And anticipation can be probably can be in the form of imagination or inferences.
So the very I didn't hear the very last part. Anticipation could be what? Sorry, could you just repeat that last?
Because you reject the idea that adopting someone's perspective is imaginatively adopting, right? Yeah. So if we do anticipating others' mind, maybe it is kind of imagination.
And okay, sorry. Okay, I get it. So no. So listen. I have never said that we do not occasionally make inferences about other people's mental states. I've never said that we do not imagine other people's mental states. I've never said that. The only thing I say is that there are also other means, that we also use other means of understanding others. So my beef with, theory and simulation theory is not about whether we occasionally use these resources. No, my beef is whether there's also a more experiential, perceptually based form of other understanding. And that's the view that I'm defending. And I'm not saying, and I have never said that way of understanding others is infallible. So clearly there are misunderstandings possible, but it's a bit like also thinking about perception. On some accounts, and of course I realize that there are many different ways of thinking about perception. But I would say, when I'm right now, I'm looking out my window at a tree. I say this is fairly direct, at least on an experiential level. That again does not rule out that I might be that I might occasionally misperceive something. So I don't think that directness entails infallibility. And I would say, and you kind of you mentioned that yourself. I think that by having relationships of reciprocity, by engaging in dialogue with others, I also think, we might minimize, chances of misunderstanding, precisely because we also allow the person that we are trying to understand to reply back regarding whether our understanding of him or her is to the point. And again, I'm not saying that communication might not also occasionally involve misunderstandings. I guess we all know of cases where that happened. But again, that was never, my point was never to insist that on infallibility. And then finally, the issue about anticipation. Well, I do think you are right. I think this would also be something that many phenomenologists would insist upon. That they would insist there is a temporal dimension to all forms of understanding, to all forms of experience, and part of that temporal structure is precisely also the constant anticipation of what is just about to come. And I think that anticipation also kind of prepares you or perhaps gives you a certain bias vis-a-vis expecting something to happen. But of course, we can also sometimes be surprised. And I think this is also what normal social interaction, is about, that, well, people don't always behave in the way we were expecting them to. Fortunately so, I would say. This is what makes social life, invigorating and interesting. But again, I guess the main point is just, that I would not, I'm not committed to the view that we never make use of inferences or that we never use imagination. I certainly think we do, but I just also think there are other more immediate, more direct forms of understanding available.
I see. Thanks for answering.
So last question. So could you just turn on your mic? Yeah.
Yes. Hello. I don't know if you see me.
Yes,
Hi, Professor. Very interesting. Many questions. I'll try to make sense of my thinking here. So first of all, I don't know how you think of that. Consciousness is literally, etymologically, con and science. So we know together, we see together. So self-consciousness is kind of an oxymoron. Then I was thinking that I come from theoretical computation neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, and I was actually modeling the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma, where two agents are interacting. And I was coming from a point of view of theory of mind, where you have in your mind, you have a model of the other, as the previous, I think, said a similar thing. And you have a model of the other, and the model of the other has a model of you. Let's say, let's stop there. So you take into account these two levels, and it can go deeper in the iteratively. Also, we take this also on the other side, in agency, in artificial intelligence, when you have an agent moving into an environment, you model it as, I have a model of the world in my mind. But the model of the world in my mind includes others. Okay, so try to go to my question. So usually when we're dealing with this, the I is outside of this model. So as I understand from what you are saying, the I is inside of the model. So I have a model of the world, and my identity is inside of this model. So depending of which model of the world I have, this I changes, is a different I. Let's again, it's related to the question we or I first. Then on the next level, we have in this model of the world, there are others, I don't relate to them. And there are we's, as you said, that they don't know me. So I don't understand the difference between the others that don't know me, and the we that do not and makes an I, and the we that don't know me and makes an I. And then the other is the we that knows me, so which makes another I. And the difference, you say, is that the we that knows me constitutes on that they have a model of I in them. As in this language, for example, that they have a perception of me as well as I have of them. So that's what distinguishes this type of we. So one question is how the model of how the others that don't know me is different from the we that don't know me in terms of me, of the I that defines, how all these different I's relate to each other. I mean, I'm trying in terms of modeling, as you understand. I'm trying in Venus diagrams. I'm trying to make a diagram in my mind. How all this interact. And then as a last thing about the this connectedness, the shared experience that you say, is that if I have a model of the other that has a model of me and I have a perception, then a shared experience could be that my understanding of the perception of the other about me matches my perception. And that could be the shared experience. Also, the other can have a similar thinking that has a model of me, that I have a model of them, and my model of them matches their perception. So individually, we have a matching perceptions, we have shared experience in our minds, but we never know if this shared experience actually are similar. And so your connectedness, this last sentence, your connectedness, what does it do? How does it apply? How do you think about this? Sorry for the long.
No. So listen, I'm not sure I can really address everything you were asking about. And I also think, I mean, honestly, I have a bit of a problem with the whole modeling way of, thinking about these matters. And I guess, I mean, there is this question of there's a little bit of a question of this, and this is certainly not directed against you, but it's more kind of a disciplinary struggle here in the sense of what has primacy. I mean, should we kind of accept the modeling talk and then try to come up with descriptions and analysis that can fit into that modeling talk? Or is it the other way around, that the starting point should be a certain description of what we find in our world of experience, and then it must be the obligation or the task of the model people somehow to try to do justice to those descriptions? I mean, so there is a kind of a disciplinary meta discussion, a little bit lurking, in the back of this conversation. So I do have So I mean, my way of approaching these matters is not by thinking about models inside my head. I mean, I don't really find that very helpful. So that is a little bit a challenge. But let me try perhaps to pick up on two of the points you were making. So one had to do with this question of what is the difference between a we where the other members do not know me, and, if you will, an outgroup where the members of that outgroup do not know me. I mean, is that not somehow one and the same thing? But I would say no, there is an important difference, because what makes me and the other members of a we, even though we do not know each other, is precisely this issue of identifying with certain norms or values that we take to be constitutive of the group in question. And I mean, those identifying links, for instance, I don't know, I mean, it's always very difficult to spell out what exactly constitutes the constitutive marks of being a proper Dane. I mean, it's even a problematic question, even though some politicians, at least in Denmark, are currently very hooked up on trying to answer that question. I mean, it's very hard to come up with a list about what is it that makes you a Dane rather than not a Dane. But let's just assume that it has something to do with there's a certain set of norms, there's a certain reliance on a shared history and tradition and so on and so forth. And then you could say, well, the outgroup members, say, I don't know, Albanians, I mean, clearly they are shaped by a very different history than the one that unites me with my compatriots. So there's a difference there, and being shaped by and identifying with that set of norms and values and shared history is also something that influences the way I in every day go about thinking and acting and believing, which makes me different from the outgroup members who do not know me. So I think the fact of whether they know me or not is not the decisive point. What is decisive is the issue of identification with a certain set of norms and values and history. So that would be the one thing. The other thing that I just wanted quickly to address was perhaps this question of how do we, I mean, if I have, because I was mentioning that to one of the previous speakers, I mean, I think we have to acknowledge that we simultaneously can partake in a variety of different we's. I mean, there's the we of my family, there's the we of my colleagues, there's the we of, I don't know, again, the national community. These are three very different we's. I don't think it's as if I can only partake in one at any given time. I think I'm influenced by and I partake in all three. And then of course, one question could be, well, but does that not lead to some kind of, I don't know, split personality? How are we supposed to somehow unite those different identities? And I think my take there would be to say, well, I mean, let's not forget that there is a certain there's a certain stream of consciousness that underlies all these experiences, all these identifications. And I mean, so I think, the situation would be completely different if I was suffering from some kind of a dissociative identity disorder, and then occasionally, there was the we of my colleagues, and then I shifted personality, and it was a completely separate stream of consciousness that had to do with my wife. And again, of course, this is not how it works. It's one stream of experiences that somehow underlies all these different identifications. So I would say what allows us to identify, or what allows us to unify those different identities is again our stream of experiences. That would be my kind of proposal. Yeah, but I'm sorry, there was too much in your question. I couldn't really do justice to it.
Okay, so we cannot take any more questions. I express my deep gratitude in regards to Professor Zahavi for being with us, and I request Amritanath to convey the vote of thanks.
Yeah, no, and let me also thank both of the organizers and all of you being present. I hope I appreciate all the questions. I'm sorry if I could not address them to the extent that they deserved, but I hope perhaps to have given you, an interest in reading the book, because surely the book contains these arguments in a much more fleshed out manner than I was able to convey them on this occasion.
And we have already shared the link of your Amazon link of your book in the group, so that people can get chance of reading this. So, over to you, Amritanath, for the vote of thanks. Yeah. Please unmute yourself.
Unmute yourself. Yeah.
Sorry, I just kept myself mute because I didn't want to bother you guys. Yeah, thank you, Professor Zahavi, for this, such a great speech, talk, and for your attentiveness. And thank you, Nilamba, for moderating with such care. On behalf of Poorvam and on behalf of everyone who joined us this evening, I want to express a genuine gratitude. And Being We is a work that will repay many readings. We hope this conversation has been a useful first entry into it. And we will share a recording with our community in due course. Please do stay connected with Poorvam. The next session in our Authors in Conversation series is coming up on the 13th of June. And our guest will be Arjun Bharadwaj, a scholar, polyglot, and contributing editor of PIJCACE. And he will be having a conversation with us on his new book, The Dramatic Element in Kumar Sambhavam. So this session will be moderated again by Nilamba Chakraborty. It's a free to attend, online, and open to all. Details are already shared, and we look forward to see you there. And thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
And thank you again, Dan, for being with us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.